And we saved one of the most exciting initiatives for the last. Michael Cantor will be speaking about Placebo that Pfizer is leading.
Thank you, Lynn and Frank, and the IOM for inviting me to speak. Thank you all for staying. And I just have to start with our typical disclaimer. These are my views, not necessarily the views of Pfizer. So the panel is about standards, and I wanted to talk about it in terms of a project that we're working on called Placebo. And I think, just kind of the summary of what we've been encountering with this is a theme that's been going on throughout most of the day, is that the social and the cultural and the incentives part of this are really much more challenging than the issues, technical issues in building these kind of projects. So ePlacebo is an idea that's been kicking around at Pfizer for a long time, probably the last 2 or 3 years. You've heard a lot of other projects that are going on around placebo, like the CAMD initiatives. Tomorrow you'll hear about the SAGE initiative as well. But overall, our idea is to pull data from placebo and control arms across multiple clinical trials in multiple therapeutic areas, so not necessarily limited to Alzheimer's disease, for example, but really across all trials, into a MART that you could actually use as a research utility. And I think the way we were able to get this started is actually we had kind of the perfect storm of things happening within the company. I mean, we had a group that was called Business Intelligence that I was a part of, and Ed Bowen, who's here in the audience, was also a part of. We had support for doing some innovative work, and we were able to actually get the people who knew the data well enough to bring it all together in one repository. So what we see the potential for this, there's several, obviously, as you've heard during the day, for placebo data in general. But for us, really, it's using as potentially as a comparison group to help evaluate events that you might see in trials if you want to get background rates for events, and also potentially to look at placebo effect, as some other initiatives are doing in a broader population, or actually potentially to reduce the size of a placebo arm that you would need in a clinical trial that you were designing. So our internal MART so far that we built has about 20,000 patients in it from hundreds of trials, again, across all of our different therapeutic areas. But we think that this research utility could be a lot more useful with a much broader participation, so a broader industry-wide participation, for example. And we presented this to the CMD steering committee last month. And this is also part of an initiative at Pfizer that's called Data Without Borders, that our research business technology group, R&D business technology group has been leading. And it's also kind of linking along with these other collaborations that Pfizer is doing, like our Centers for Therapeutic Innovation that we're working with a lot of academic medical centers. So anytime you're trying to build one of these large-scale databases, it highlights the importance of standards. It's really essential for looking at cross-program, and particularly if you're going to do a cross-industry or cross-academia type of initiative, you'll need that for the analysis. If you think about the CEDAS standard, it's basically got relatively wide adoption, but like a lot of standards, the way it's actually implemented locally has slight differences that oftentimes make the analysis a lot more difficult afterwards. You can actually lose some of the details there. It certainly also gives you a little more confidence in your data quality, but really you have to look at that in terms of the questions that you're asking, and like people have talked about during the day as well, the reproducibility of the results that you're getting as well when you're looking across different data sources. So our major issues that we had when we were working with ePlacebo are really two. And because of those issues, we ended up only using relatively recent studies in our database. The first issue is along the technical issue, and that's really about the standards internally. So as many of you know, Pfizer, we've acquired several companies throughout the years. So we have data from several different companies, from several different systems, that can be 20 or 30 years old or older. And so we only really had a consistent Pfizer data standard implemented within the last decade. So we ended up being only really practically able to use the recent studies for this project. We also had issues with, so that's a technical issue, and looking at the other issue is really around informed consent. And in the past, informed consent was written in a very narrow way, so that data could be used particularly for that specific trial. But actually, for Pfizer as well, lately our informed consent language has been a little bit broader, so you can actually use the data for research that's not directly related to your initial study, and that obviously makes it a lot easier to use that study in a pooled initiative. And we think that actually the informed consent issue is almost more challenging because you can actually always change your database schema. Once you have an informed consent down, that's really fixed. There's really no changes to that. So, if you look at standards, how this would facilitate these types of initiatives, I think a lot of these issues have come up already today, but it's unlikely that, the process of pooling data is ever going to be seamless. But if you have some agreed upon standards, it makes this much easier. But then, of course, the question is, which standard you're using, who controls that standard, who ultimately make those decisions. There were questions that came up earlier about, you have a lot of academics in the room, you have a lot of collaborators in the room, and they can't agree upon a standard. We have the issue internally as well. You have internal standards that you're supposed to use, and the trial teams, end up using them on and implementing them kind of in a, I don't want to say a haphazard way, but in a way that's not necessarily files that standard exactly. And the question is, how does that happen? And I think part of it is the lack of political will for people to say, you know what, this is the standard, this is what you have to do, use it, and here are the consequences. And, it's interesting that the NIH, there's a potential issue, I think, for the NIH is the funding agency. And, they're fighting with the academics sometimes for people who to adopt a standardized process, but they control the purse strings, and so so I think that there's some potential there to do some enforcement around using standards, both on the politically and economically as well. So ultimately, our goal for ePlacebo is to provide a resource that would be very inclusive, would be relying on standards and would span disease areas, rather than having a very specific, limited database limited to a single disease, so that researchers could use this data for really broad purposes. And you can also get the quantity of populations that would be broadly representative. We assume that initially there would be some type of governance board that would confirm the scientific validity of questions, but really the ideal would be to have this almost as a self-service, data that set that could be used by for any legitimate research purpose. If it is set up as a repository, we would assume it would be hosted by a third party like CPATH. But I think there's also potential to have the distributed data network use as well, so that the data stays at its institutions and then it's queried in a federated manner. I think the last thing, getting back to the incentives issue, and this project really brings up internally for us too, the incentives around preparing data for reuse and when the process should occur, either if it's upfront or in the end, as a lot of people have talked about as well. I think when you're dealing with something as complex as clinical trials, you really need to invest in that upfront, and make sure also if you're using this, that it's also you have kind of almost a separate repository that's not part of day-to-day operations, where you can actually make that investment as well. I think standards obviously make it much easier to overcome the technical hurdles to broad-based cooperative projects like ePlacebo, but you really need the right set of incentives for people and institutions to ultimately contribute their data. So thank you very much.